BA Optional English Semester 3 Poetry Recap. So, here we're going to see all that we have studied so far, the poems that were discussed. We discussed poems from the Victorian age. From Victorian age, we had Ring Out Wild Bells to the Wild Sky by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Then we had Porphyria's Lover by Robert Browning. We also had extract from Aurora Lay by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and we had Thou Art Indeed Just Lord Gerard Manley Hopkins. And under modernism and modern poetry, we discussed A Prayer for My Daughter by W.B. Yeats and The Shield of Achilles by W.H. Auden. Now we shall look at characteristics of Victorian poetry. The first one anybody can think of is dramatic monologue. This is clearly brought out in Porphyria's Lover. Irony and characterization, dark humor and social commentary. It's tender and passionate. Realism. There is also questioning God, interest in medieval myths and folklore, focus on sensory elements, recurring themes of religious science conflict, ideas about nature and Alfred Lord Tennyson, 1809-1892, representative Victorian poet. His poetry reflects the major movements of his age like expansion of imperial power, industrialization, loss of faith in established religion, and its precepts due to publication of Darwin's work. His friend Arthur Hallam is a major influence on him. Ring Out Wild Bells. New Year hymn taken from part 4 of In Memoriam, written on the eve of Christmas, third Christmas after Hallam's death, last in optimistic phase of the poet's meditation. Poet turns away from the past and its grief which sapped his mind, looks ahead for a bright future, hopes the best for humankind. Characteristics of Robert Browning's poems. Browning's poems were in contrast to Tennyson's. Tennyson's poems were lyrical, subjective, and finely crafted, whereas Browning's poems were bold, rugged, and totally unconventional in matter and style. His interest was centered in moral and spiritual forces and conflicts of people. His signature art form was detached speech and dramatic monologue. Psychological insights, analytical subtlety, dramatic interpretation also are the characteristics of Robert Browning's poems. Porphyria's Lover is an interesting poem for many reasons. One, it might seem like a murder mystery. The girl comes in, shuts the door, and sits next to the narrator. It's a dramatic monologue. She comes out of the storm and sets about making a fire in the cottage. She offers herself to the narrator of the poem, who strangles her using her golden hair. Ironically, he murders her to preserve that particular moment of perfect love. Reader can sense that they have had imperfect and disturbed relationship, or maybe not. It's more about uh, the way the lover thinks. Though the poem does not make an explicit mention of it, there's so much to it. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, we know that she is one of the best Victorian period women writers. She suffered a lifelong illness and she was a semi invalid. She is widely known for her treatment of social injustice. She has worked on slave trade and also child labor. She has written so much for women. Her writings on subjugation of women of her age earned her status as an early feminist. And well, she was in love with Robert Browning, and she has written quite some works after her marriage with him. Aurora Leigh. It is a verse novel and an example of Bildung's Roman novel. And this poem talks about Aurora's struggles to establish herself as a professional woman poet. This is the time where women were not given enough freedom to um, mm, excel in whatever they were good at. Aurora determines to define her own life rather than accept a man's vision of her. The book too recalls Aurora's childhood and opens with 20th birthday in June. Romney is Aurora's cousin, and he tells her that in the sense, women cannot produce great art, and Aurora rejects his prejudiced view, and she turns down the proposal. And she makes it very clear that female or women are not weak. And we also read Gerard Manley Hopkins, "Thou art just indeed, Lord," and then the way he writes the poem is very interesting. He starts with an argument, and then he says, "Why is it that the sinners flourish?" And yeah, Gerard Manley Hopkins was an English poet under Jesuit priest. He was considered to be the first of the great modern poets, and we also know that he was influenced by the Oxford movement in 1866. And before he became a priest, he had a collection of his work which he felt that should be destroyed once he became a priest. But after that, he started writing again, and we know that The Wreck of the Jutland was his one of the best poems, and he employs sprung rhythm. Hopkins questions God about his treatment of sinners and his believers. He expresses his frustration for the disparity. He always felt that he expresses that sinners are always flourishing, whereas a believer like Hopkins has not been able to achieve anything in the form of poetry. And now he says that he feels barren, and he seeks poetic inspiration, and he seeks the blessings of God or God's help for him to write a great poem. Now we move on to modern poetry. We did a lot about how modern poetry came into existence, and then we also talked about the main reason that modern poetry emerged due to industrialization and urbanization. And here we notice that modern poetry talks more, or it's more about intellectual and cerebral, and it is not much to do with emotions. It is chiefly imagistic and involves symbolism. And yes, if one has to understand modern poetry, one has to be familiar with quite some earlier texts because of the poems or the works being full of allusions and intertextual references. Impersonal, anti-romantic, innovative in attitude. Above all, it was very challenging lexically, semantically, and grammatically. Yes. W.B. Yeats, a strong adherent of the Irish national movement, hence closely involved in establishing an Irish national theatre. He was the director of Abbey Theatre, During the theater years, he befriended two women. Sadly, Modgon is more popular, being WB. It's his um, infatuation. He also befriended one more person, Lady Gregory. A Prayer for My Daughter, poem composed soon after the birth of Annie Butler Yeats. When he writes this, he's actually thinking about how his daughter might face the world, and he prays for her. Along with that, he also gives some advices. Next, we have W.H. Auden, and we know that he is the most influential Anglo American poet of the 20th century. The shield of Achilles becomes a symbol of art which reflects the life and culture of the time. So what he does here is he through the shield he shows us the barren wilderness, totalitarian leaders turning multitudes of human beings into unthinking robots, bored bureaucrats watching with indifference and execution. While Hephaestus is a symbol of the poet or artist with the shield standing for art or poetry, that is, represents the reader or the public or the observer.